back to this guy.
Estimating. If you look at Zoomers, I don't have slides on this, but there's just a lot of really interesting ways that they're very different in the data. They're much more likely than previous generations to say that making money is extremely important to them. They are a lot more, if you look at their psychographic data, they have a lot higher levels of, psychometric neuroticism and anxiety than the people before them. If I was going to speculate, I think that, phones and social media have a lot to do with this. I think it's very plausible to me, and I've heard people describe that, these kids grew up looking at social media influencers as role models. But all I can say is that I think that young people today seem to have fairly different values than they did 10 years ago. How that translates into partisan politics depends on what the parties do, but I think it's a big shift.
It seems plausible to me that social media, online culture are splitting the media that young men and women get.
Right.
That if you are young and online and a 23-year-old man who is interested in UFC, you're being driven into a very intense male online world. Yeah. Whereas if you are 23 years old and female, and
even
you
just
are
gendered.
interested in things that the YouTube algorithm codes that way, you are not entering that world. You're actually entering the opposite world. You're seeing Brene Brown, right? You're seeing these other things.
Right.
The capacity to be in highly gendered media worlds is really different in 2024 than it was in 2004. And that's true worldwide.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. Online communities are way more gender segregated than offline communities are. And so in that respect, it should be unsurprising that suddenly shifting a bunch of young people's social worlds to be entirely online all at once, caused the political situation to change.
So Democrats are getting destroyed now among young voters.
That's right.
I do think there was, even as the idea of the rising Democratic majority had become a little discredited in 2016 and 2020, I do think Democrats believed that these young voters were eventually going to save them.
Right.
That this was a last gasp of something. That if Donald Trump couldn't run these numbers up among seniors and you had millennials really coming into their voting power, Gen Z coming in, that was going to be the end of this Republican Party.
Right.
And that just completely false.
Yeah,
it always is. Never rely on the young people.
I have to admit,
Never.
I was one of those liberals 4 years ago.
Never.
And it seems like I was
They
wrong.
always let us down.
The future has a way of surprising us. The flip side of this is that Democrats made a bunch of gains among old voters, and I'm sure that they'll be happy that they did 2 years from now, 2 years from now in the midterms. But if we don't do anything about this, then this problem could become very bad. So right here, I have this slide. This is very simple. This is just showing exit poll favorability for the Democratic and Republican presidential candidate in 2020 and 2024. And, I think it's just really important to ground any discussion of the election with the simple fact that Donald Trump was just as unpopular on election day last year as he was in 2020, and maybe even a little bit more unpopular. But what changed is that Biden had a net favorability rating of +6, and Harris had a net favorability rating of -6.
So I want to play Mike Donnellan, who was chief strategist to Joe Biden, was recently at a forum. And he made an argument that I think you at least could read this chart as backing up, which is that, Biden was more popular in 2020 than Harris was in 2024. Maybe the Biden-Harris switch was a mistake. Here's Donnellan.
Look, I think folks who had this view believed that, that Biden was going to lose. He didn't have it anymore. He had to get out. That was the best thing for the party. I understand that's their view. Okay? I have a view too.
Oh, God. Now is this called Sunday or Monday morning quarterbacking? When is football? Is it Sunday or Thursday? I don't remember. Listen, I was a big Biden supporter. I didn't want him to drop, okay? I think, right? I was against him dropping. I think Harris should have stayed. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know for a fact that if Biden would have stayed in, we would have won the election. I could say that if I was bad faith. It's bad faith to people like Fabian accusing me, but I don't know. It's possible he would have lost even worse. It's possible he would have won, but it was really, really, really hard to tell that at the time. I feel like anybody who was being honest would have to concede that it was very hard to tell that at the time. But
right. And my view is, I think it was insane. I think the party lost its mind.
Did the party lose its mind, and that's why we see this chart?
I think the best explanation for why Kamala Harris was unpopular is in this next slide, which is just that the Biden administration was extremely unpopular for most of its term. They saw their approval fall off a cliff after Afghanistan, and then it dropped further as inflation and immigration and the budget fights all happened in the fall, and then it never recovered. And, I think the big challenge, that Kamala Harris faced was just that she was seen.
Before he says it, one of the issues why I feel like the popularity falls is, again, it's so funny because I remember Dan saying this a lot, and I agreed with him, and maybe a lot of us said this. The problem, I don't know if I get into this, might have been the attention economy, right? Think about it. Afghanistan and the you could argue the blunder of the pullout there and the deaths, that resulted was a bad thing, and it was a media event, and we saw it. But one of the things that Dan said a lot, and I said this too, isn't it nice not having to see the president on fucking Twitter every day doing some crazy fucking shit that is just Biden's doing his job, and we don't have to worry every day what crazy shit the president is tweeting or what crazy this is up to? Well, we might consider that to be a positive thing. Maybe that's not a positive thing. Maybe him not being on Twitter every day means, well, what do you know about Joe Biden? Joe Biden, let's see. It's the Hassan strategy. Wasn't he the guy that fucked up Afghanistan? Wasn't that who Joe Biden was? And that's like your last big memory of him, because Biden's not on the media. He's not, doing talk shows or tweeting every fucking day. And the only time you see Biden brought up, really, it seems, is probably like when Republicans are attacking him. Biden's normalcy and his not engaging with the crazy media environment that conservatives have now carved out, that's to be expected for political engagement, his lack of engagement might have actually been bad, right?
As too close, to the Biden administration, which most voters consider to be a failure. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can never tell. You can never tell a counterfactual world, but I think that Biden would have had an even harder time distinguishing himself from his record.
Possibly.
Yeah, it'd be even harder for Joe Biden to run away from Joe Biden, I guess.
Yeah.
Looking at this chart, it looks like by January, a plus 20 net disapproval. Maybe that was a little bit smaller in November, but it had been widening. I mean, you go back to beginning of 2023, it was narrower. People were really pissed at the Biden administration by the time we hit the election.
Yeah. I think that's, the big salient fact about this election. And, I don't think it was impossible, for Kamala to do better. This was a winnable election at the end of the day. It was very close. But this was the big thing, that was weighing Democrats down. And so, I just want to move forward, just in terms of why. In our polling, the way that we measure issue importance is we show people two random issues and we just ask which of these issue problems is more important, to the problems facing the country today. And, people pick. And, when you model it out, whenever you have cost of living or
Cost of living or inflation. Oh, I wonder if he's going to say, whenever you have cost of living or inflation as your big issue, then the incumbent party is always going to have a rough time.
inflation put up against something else, 8 or 9 out of 10 people picked that cost of living and inflation was more important. And so I think this just really shows how dominant this was. Voters were really angry about the Biden administration's handling of inflation, of the budget deficit, of, crime, of immigration. And I think that, that was just a hard thing to escape.
Well, you just ticked off a bunch of issues, but what's interesting to me about this particular bit of data is it shows that cost of living and inflation beat almost anything put in front of it. So
I agree.
What I find notable here, cost of living was bigger than student debt, fair. But you tested against immigration and border security, and the share of voters saying cost of living or inflation was more important was about 70%.
That's right.
You tested it against abortion. Their cost of living or inflation was more important to about 80% of voters. Against environment and climate change, 84% of voters picked cost of living and inflation. One thing that the Biden people always believed was that this election would be very heavily about democracy itself. This was something that I was told by top Biden strategists going way back. I don't see democracy on here, January 6th, the stability of the system. Did you test that too?
No, we did. And, later...
I think democracy was really important for anybody that was politically plugged in, so for liberals. But for anybody that wasn't, it was probably a non-issue. So if you ask people, is democracy important? And they're a person who's the kind of person to answer polls or to be involved in polling like that, then they probably say, oh yeah, that's really important to me. But if you're not, then you probably just don't give a fuck. You're my guess.
We have a slide on, I'm just going to scroll down to it now since you brought it up. But, we did a survey where we just asked people, what's more important right now? Preserving America's institutions or, delivering change that improves people's lives. And it was 78 to 18, delivering change that improves people's lives. And I'm just going to scroll up. But I think what's really hard, I think this has been one of the hardest things about, being a political consultant in the last 8 years, is that, every day Trump does terrible things that I think are objectively awful and scary and that piss me off.
But most Americans have no clue and don't give a fuck about it. They don't know about it. And even if they did, they might not even care about it.
I'm going to prosecute my enemies or, whatever. And then we do a bunch of tests and voters really don't want to hear about it, from us. I think that Trump would do better if he didn't do that stuff, for sure. But I think that, voters want us to talk about, concrete ways that they're going to improve people's lives.
There's an argument you hear from many Democrats. There was no problem here except for inflation. That, in fact, if you compare Democratic vote outcomes with incumbent parties in many other countries, Democrats did better than incumbent parties in other countries did. So you look at the Conservatives in the UK, they had a much worse election result. You look at what happened to the ruling coalition in France.
This is a weird argument. Inflation definitely played a huge role into it. But it's always weird. I don't know philosophically how you deal with this when it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. Imagine you have a beaker that's like a 10-liter beaker, and you've got 11 students who pour 1 liter of water into it. Is the last student that pours the water, is it his fault? Because if any one of them wouldn't have done it, it would have changed. Or if one student poured 5 liters in and 6 other students poured 1 liter in, is it the 6th and 5th student's fault, or is it the guy who poured the most? It's hard to figure out what is the reason why. Technically, all of them are the reason if the election was that close. This happened with Hillary as well. Did Comey make Hillary lose the election? Yeah, I guess. Did the email stuff, the whole email scandal, did that make her lose it? Yeah, I guess. Did Benghazi? Maybe. It might have. Every individual thing could have when it's that close, all of these things are the straw that breaks the camel's back.
In some ways, Democrats were doing fine. They had a fairly modest drop in support. And it's just a shame for them that inflation happened on their watch. That if Donald Trump had won the 2020 election, inflation would have happened on his watch, completely discrediting him and his administration, and that would have been the end of them. how do you distinguish between there's a broad structural problem the Democratic Party is facing that it needs to think about for 2028, and there's actually no problem here?
But I think, I just want to go over to the next slide. When we measure issues, we measure how important voters find it, and that's what we have in the bottom here. And then we just measure,
Jesus.
Do you trust Democrats or Republicans more?
Issue importance versus trust in Democrats. Oh, okay, you kind of have a line here, I guess.
On this issue. And what you see here is if you look at the top issues that voters care the most about, cost of living, the economy, taxes and government spending, the deficit, foreign policy, healthcare. Other than healthcare, where Democrats have a narrow lead, Republicans have massive trust advantages, 15 points on all of the issues that voters care the most about. And so the story that I would tell in response to your question is that in this election, voters trusted Republicans way more than Democrats on all of the most important issues, but also bought into this idea that Donald Trump was a terrible person who couldn't be trusted with power. And that made the election be close. But 4 years from now, Donald Trump will not be the nominee. And maybe they'll nominate somebody who's just as terrible and just as unlikable. But if we don't, get out of this trust deficit, I think that, we'll have a lot of problems.
For people.
It's interesting, too, that when you pull on that, I wonder if this guy would talk digitally. We were almost ready to talk in New York. The David Shore guy. I feel like the challenge is, though, like when you say they liked Trump on cost of living, did they really like Trump on cost of living, or were they just comparing the years under Trump to the years under Biden, where we had like the mega inflation, right? Like, are we pulling in another way on inflation, right? Is, I guess, my question. And then if you're talking about, trust, do they really not trust the Democrats versus the Republicans? Or is it just that under Biden, we had a lot of inflation and that sucked. And under Trump, at least for the first 3 years, that didn't seem to be the issue and that didn't suck. So we trust them more,
Listening along, this is a chart broken into quadrants.
That's right.
And the top right quadrant is issues that are very important and issues where Democrats are more trusted. And it's an untilled bit of farmland up there.
That's right.
So there's mental health, which voters don't rate that important, but they do trust Democrats quite a bit more. They rate it higher than they rate, though, climate change and the environment and abortion, which struck me as surprising. Mental health seems like a much bigger deal on this than I think politics reflects on either side.
Right.
Their one bright spot is really healthcare.
That's right.
That's kind of it in terms of issues where it is quite important and they have a genuinely noticeable advantage.
I was going to say that the advantage there is barely noticeable, which is crazy, by the way. Remember, Trump came in to destroy the entire ACA. That was what he was elected to do in 2016, and they failed, but they were one vote off. And to see Democrats have like a 3-point lead, if this is 5 percentage points, what is that, 3 or 2.5 percentage points? Jesus.
Their one bright spot is really healthcare.
That's right.
That's kind of it in terms of issues where it is quite important and they have a genuinely noticeable advantage.
Yeah, I think it's just worth saying that 4 years ago, the number one issue was COVID and healthcare, and those also were the issues that people trusted Democrats the most on. And so the strategy was really obvious, just talk a lot about COVID and healthcare. But this time we had a much harder problem, which was that the issues that people cared the most about, for the most part, voters didn't trust us on. And the issues that people did trust us on, climate change, and reproductive rights, probably the big ones, voters just didn't care very much about. And so that was just a very difficult strategic position. And it's also one that was just very different than it was 4 years ago.
All right, I just want to tick off some issues voters ranked as important that they trusted Republicans on and then ask you a question about it. So they thought cost of living, the economy, inflation were very important, had a lot more trust in Republicans. They thought national security and foreign policy were important, trusted Republicans. Taxes, government spending, government debt, trusted Republicans. Crime, immigration, trusted Republicans. Social security, trusted Republicans. That seems like a bad one for Democrats. A political division, they thought was important. They trusted Republicans a bit more on that in this data. If I looked over time, right, if I looked at 2016 and I looked at 2020, would I see on all of these that Republicans had advantages and Democrats were just winning on healthcare? How much of this is something flipping around as an incumbent penalty and a sort of reaction to conditions in the country at that moment? And how much of it is a durable situation where Republicans have a trust advantage where Democrats would have to act in a spectacular way over time to change voters' impressions of them on that issue?
What we saw in our data was that as the Biden administration became a lot more unpopular, all of these things dropped a lot. So some of it was uniform shift. But I think that, the last 4 years, there were some things that structurally changed a lot. In every center-left party in the world, generally the left has its issues that it owns and the right has its issues that it owns. But usually the economy is pretty neutral. During the Trump administration, the economy was fairly neutral. And in 2020, I think if you look at this, and even in 2021, it really didn't look anything like this. Another really big shift was just that education has gone from being basically one of the best issues for Democrats to being something that's basically neutral now. And, we saw that, in the Virginia gubernatorial election in 2021, we even saw it be an advantage for Republicans. And then, the other big shift, on the other side, was that reproductive rights used to be a fairly neutral issue for Democrats. Like in general, when you talked about it in the pre-Dobbs era, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't something that changed a lot of votes. And immediately after Dobbs, we saw party trust, on reproductive rights shoot up. And so I think, these numbers, they do change. And this is, one of the big messages I want to get through is just that, the world has changed a lot in the last 4 years. It's going to keep changing, and we have to kind of adjust in response to what happens.
All right, so tell me what's going on in this next slide, because also, as I understand, this is really very connected to the work you do specifically.
Right.
So what are you doing here?
All right, so one of the big things that my firm does, it's probably our biggest product, is that we do randomized controlled trials on ads. This is something that both parties do. This is pretty standard. But the idea is that for a given ad, you take 1,000 people, you split them into a treatment and control group. 500 people see the ad, 500 people don't, and then you survey them after, and you ask them who they're voting for. And then the difference between treatment and control can be described as the causal effect of if you see this ad, this is the effect it will have on your chance of voting for them. And so, we tested on the order of, I'd say probably like 4,000 or 5,000 Harris ads last cycle. And I just wanted to call out, these two ads that were in the top 1% of ads that we tested. One is from Kamala Harris.
I get it. The cost of rent, groceries, and utilities is too high. So here's what we're going to do about it. We will lower housing costs by building more homes and crack down on landlords who are charging too much. We will lower your food and grocery bills by going after price gougers who are keeping the cost of everyday goods too high. I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message because you work hard for your paycheck. You should get to keep more of it. As president, I'll make that my top priority.
Thank you.
Obviously, there's a lot for several parts of the Democratic coalition there. Another ad by Future Forward shows tax him for a national sales tax, for the idea that Trump...
Tax him being Trump.
Yeah, tax Trump.
He fights for himself and his billionaire friends. He intends to enact a national sales tax, the Trump tax, that would raise prices on middle-class families by $4,000 a year. Instead of a tax hike, we will pass a middle-class tax cut that will benefit more than 100 million Americans.
As a package responsible for the content of this ad.
These were obviously the best ads in the campaign. And the point I just want to say is I think this reinforces the point that what voters cared the most about was the cost of living, and that voters were really mad, about the actual situation. And I think that Harris being able to, in this ad, acknowledging, oh, things are actually very bad. I don't like this. I have a plan to fix this, is part of what made it so effective.
There's a view out there. I saw Jacobin had just done some research on this, which is a socialist publication, that at the beginning of the Harris campaign sprint, she was only the head of the Democratic ticket for 3 months, she was talking a lot about the economy. And that by the end, she was talking a lot about democracy. That there had been a change in the nature of the campaign, the ads it was running, how they were messaging. Their big closing argument was at the ellipsis in Washington, D.C.
Because Jacobin is a dog shit. It's like Intercept tier of garbage fucking publication. This is a horrible. I'm surprised he reads it. But
which is where the sort of January 6th riots in a way began. That there was sort of phases of the Harris campaign. And the first one was more populist and the last one was more institutional. From what you saw, was that true?
I think that there was this big strategic question that Democrats faced, and it wasn't just the Harris campaign, which is, polling would tell them you should talk about the economy, or voters care a lot about the cost of living. But, it's very hard, one, to get media attention on those things. And two, I think that Trump has done a good job of baiting us. I think what's really interesting about a lot of the democracy and authoritarian stuff is, just that how concerned you are by it really varies a lot by political engagement and by education. And the kind of people who set media decisions, at CNN or who work in politics are the kinds of people who are going to be much more concerned about it, than working class folks are. And so, I don't know. I think that...
But look, there is a difference between the Harris campaign was running the optimal David Shor strategy in late October of 2024, and they were not. The Harris campaign had access, Future Forward had access to all of this issue-by-issue polling. They had access to all this randomized ad testing. Did they run a heavily economic campaign and it didn't work, or did they not run a heavily economic campaign at the end and it didn't work? Because look, if they did the thing and it didn't work, then maybe it just didn't work.
yeah.
Did they not do it?
Yeah, asking the hard questions. But yeah, I think, obviously, I think the Democratic messaging last cycle was not economically focused enough. I think that it focused too much on, narratives of defending institutions, defending democracy. And I think it's just very easy, for folks to fall into that trap. But I really don't.
But why, right? If they did that, and I heard this from different people.
Right.
Like, David Plouffe is a smart guy. I'm not telling you I'm not asking you to critique David Plouffe. I can watch you getting physically uncomfortable as I harm your business here.
Right.
But these people all wanted to win. They really did. Like every single one of them. And they had a lot of data. So I think this has been a thing on my mind. If they weren't running the optimal strategy, why? I know it's hard to get media attention for things, and that's fair enough. But it's also not impossible to get media attention for things, right? For instance, it's very easy to get media attention for anti-price gouging policies because there's a lot of controversy over them about whether or not they worked. But they did make people talk about whether or not you were going to do an anti-price gouging policy. This is a Donald Trump move constantly. Announce a policy that probably doesn't work or is in some way outrageous or beyond the political possibility. Maybe it's not even all that popular when you poll, but you get people talking about you having a very strong view. Right? You're going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Everybody knows Mexico isn't going to pay for it. But you are talking about how Donald Trump hates immigration, right? And it breaks through. It is not rocket science to get people to pay attention. If Bernie Sanders had been running in the campaign, people would have paid attention to his economic messaging because he does economic messaging that creates conflict. If it was really this big delta between the economic push and the institutions push, and the institutions push is what got made, or at least got made more than one it should have, why?
the thing I'll say, in terms of why I'm sympathetic, to the people who actually had these jobs and had to make these decisions, is it just feels wrong. Like I had a situation, I mentioned this before, where donors will email me and they'll be like, oh, look at this crazy, absolutely terrible thing, this evil thing that Trump is doing. We need to test it. We need to tell the voters. You test it and it really doesn't work. People want to hear about eggs, and it's easy for me to say that, because I'm not directly in charge. But I just think it just feels really wrong when you're in the moment. And it's very hard.
There's the thing that came out that the Democrats had in that little leaked leadership meeting or whatever the fuck that, or that think tank that was like ways to change messaging. I talked about this a little bit earlier, that it feels really weird to say it, but small dollar donors probably don't represent the party. These probably are your most engaged, most politically extreme people. And you probably, to some extent, have to ignore your donors on messaging because the things that they care about are not going to be reflective of what the electorate cares about. That's probably a really hard thing to get over, I would imagine.
To totally shift direction, just because data tells you one thing.
I do think the campaign photo ops that we all remember at the end are telling, which is, it was an extraordinary visual, Harris at the Ellipse. And then there were the visuals of Donald Trump in a garbage truck and Donald Trump at McDonald's. And there was a ridiculousness to those visuals. I saw a lot of liberals making fun of them on various social media platforms. But there was something about which visuals are being chosen by the two candidates. I mean, of the two of them, only Kamala Harris had actually worked at a McDonald's.
Sure.
But she wasn't the one who ended up putting on the apron.
Like, this is a thing. Oh, fuck. Like, this is a thing where I don't know if Ezra's about to say, like, well, Donald Trump somehow found a way to make himself look like a McDonald's worker. Maybe either his analysis is too crude or mine is too crude. I don't know. It's hard to say. But I think it was just a matter of the fact that we were talking about it. Like him going out and doing some ridiculous shit. Every minute of Trump content that you consume is content that you're not consuming of Kamala Harris. We already know what Trump's positions are on all this shit. And when you watch more and more of his shit, it's not like, I don't even know if it's hurting him at this point, because the people that like him are always going to like him, but you're not consuming anything from Kamala. And Trump's ability to just continually dominate news cycles, even if it's on some retarded shit. I don't know if people necessarily saw him as like, oh my God, he really is the blue collar guy, versus like, LOL, it's Trump, ha ha ha. But you're not consuming anything from the Democrats, And
getting photographed at McDonald's. And there's a thing about what the candidates end up wanting to do that is meaningful too. And I do think there's a way in which, I wonder if that explains part of what we ended up seeing.
Each coalition's campaigns are ultimately going to reflect, the aesthetic and cultural choices of the people who staff them. And, it makes sense. Like if you had just said 2 years ago, Trump's going to end by showing up at a McDonald's, like it just wouldn't have been surprising, I think. And so it's just hard to escape, that kind of demographic pull. But we have to try because we have to actually win these people over. Okay, and so now I just have a couple more slides I want to go through. I talked about this before, but voters cared a lot more about delivering change than preserving institutions. And then we have this other polling question here, which I think is interesting, which is just, asking people to pick between the statements, things could be going better in America, but what we need is a return to basic stability. And the other is things in America are going poorly. And what's needed is a major change and a shock to the system. And when you have those two things, it's 53-37, which is a lot wider than the election result ended up being.
What really strikes me about this is that sometimes I read polls and the wording is pretty clearly there to make something sound better than the other thing.
Right. Sure.
Things could be going better in America, and what is needed is return to basic stability from whoever becomes president. And things in America are going poorly, and what is needed is a major change and a shock to the system from whoever becomes president. I would in some way say the second there is worded to turn people off a little bit. It sounds disruptive, crisis, a shock, right? It's not just major change. It is something beyond that.
Right.
And it dominates. I guess, though, I have a question about this, which is, on the one hand, we see lines like that outpolling the incremental change everywhere. On the other hand, if you look at the new split ticket ratings for who overperformed in the election, very moderate House Democrats did very well.
Totally.
There does seem to me to be a tension between two forms of political wisdom that both have data behind them right now.
Yeah, it's just such a weird thing, and I don't know why. It goes back to this question. I think I said I asked George Santos this, and he didn't have an answer either. The leftist people just don't vote. They don't show up for their candidates. When you have, and it's so frustrating because the online media, even in my audience sometimes, is like, we need to listen out Bernie messages. It's like, bro, Bernie underperformed Kamala in his own state. Like something is not working on the progressive messaging side either. It's not like they have the answer and we're just not listening, because it's not like they're overperforming. They're losing on their tickets even worse than the moderate Dems are. And the Dems that are doing the best are the moderate, boring Dems, which seems so contrary to, I guess, like the online media atmosphere. And even, I guess, to the staffers and the people that are working on the campaigns in a lot of these places too.
Now, right. Which is that voters want huge, massive change. Mm-hmm. And like the optimum political strategy is Joe Manchin or Jared Golden or Ruben Gallego, who are actually not, or Susan Collins, who are not people who promise unbelievably shocking change. They are moderates who kind of tack between the parties a little bit and, try to represent a center that wants something a little bit less dramatic than either side is offering. How do you reconcile them?
There's an enormous amount of status quo bias in politics. Campaigning on big policy changes, can be pretty unpopular. But I think, the way to thread the needle, what this is really saying is that voters were very angry about the state of things. And what they wanted tonally was someone who
Understood
acknowledged that anger.
Yeah.
Because, Ruben Gallego did a lot of criticism of the status quo and was able to outperform.
So people want an angry moderate.
That's right. I think that's exactly
Yes.
right.
Like they want not a, I always think of temperament and ideology as being.
Because there was a statement made by, I don't know, it might have even been Ezra Klein who made this statement, like 7 years ago or something. But I remember the statement of like, what Donald Trump represented wasn't any kind of coherent policy or anything, really. He just represented somebody saying, I'm really mad about stuff. And Trump said, I hear your anger. I'm going to come in and break everything. And it was like, okay. And that was it. It was just the idea that somebody heard or understood that feeling. Like, okay, yeah, he's mad too, and I'm mad, and we're going to fuck it all up. Hell yeah. Nobody cared about what came next. They just wanted somebody who was reflective of that anger that was being felt. And the policy positions don't really matter. So this, I guess, ties into where I was talking before about like messaging is the only thing that matters now. Policy and all this shit is fucking irrelevant. We have to work on messaging because at the end of the day, like they're saying, like moderate Dems are winning, but they probably have a more like the system is fucked. I mean, you can maybe even say populist, but they have like a message that's more along the lines of like, I hear you, like shit is fucked right now, but you don't have to be like a crazy anti-establishment person to have just the messaging on it.
Separate axes in American politics that we connect too much.
Right.
So we think about people who are moderates often have the moderate temperament. Susan Collins is like the great example. The joke always of the Susan Collins meter from, somewhat concerned all the way to very concerned being, the red line for her. You have a lot of moderates who by nature, they're pretty chill. They try to be civil. What this is implying is what people want are moderate policies in a more
aggressive,
revolutionary, or certainly more
scream,
upset.
Yeah,
temperament.
True.
Yeah.
We're pissed, but not ideologically extreme about it. It's like a funny chant, but
when people think about moderates, they think of, somebody like Joe Manchin, someone who's just like down the line on everything. And, the reality, I think that's an accurate description of what highly educated moderates are like. But most low socioeconomic status moderates actually have fairly incoherent views. They're liberal on some issues, they're very conservative on other issues. And I think that, that's just like a much closer fit for, and that's, when you think of that, it's maybe less surprising that a lot of them like Donald Trump.
Back in 2016,
right.
I wrote a piece about Donald Trump that has one of these headlines that now people will sometimes screenshot and be mad at me about, but it's called something like Donald Trump is a perfect moderate. And the point of the piece was not that he's not extreme, because I think he is extreme. But
he's extreme in his messaging. But Donald Trump's initial political views, he wasn't really far. Oh, wait, didn't me and Hassan have a huge argument over this? What was my position? Am I taking the opposite now? That Donald Trump really wasn't far right at all. He if anything, he had kind of a moderate platform. None of it was like ultra far right, but he had extreme messaging on everything. That was like the crazy thing. Yeah.
The way his politics worked, particularly on the campaign trail in things he said, was it was internally disorganized. So he'd be extremely far right on immigration, but compared to other Republicans, much more centrist on things like Medicare and Social Security. He would talk about giving healthcare to everybody, even though Republicans wouldn't like that. He talked about raising taxes on people like him.
Yeah.
Not how he governed.
Right.
But there's a lot of research that actual moderates, like people in the electorate who are moderate, it's not that they have a in between the two parties view on everything. It's that they might believe in completely legalized weed on the one hand.
Yeah, this is a huge thing. That people think that a moderate is somebody who's like iffy on abortion and iffy on guns and iffy, but that's not true. That's like the illusory moderate, and that these people don't exist. A moderate is somebody who is a really strong, like me in some ways, right? Like I'm a really strong Second Amendment guy, but I also believe in like abortion. That should be like a protected thing. That's like a moderate position, not your wishy-washy and everything, or you're like a centrist and everything, but that you believe in some things that Republicans tend to defend and some things that Democrats tend to defend. In the totality of my beliefs, I wouldn't be moderate, but that'd be an example of like a moderate type of position.
And mass deportations on the other. That it's like if you imagine positions as like they can be very liberal or very conservative, they average out to moderate as opposed to being consistently moderate.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And the way I like to to put that in math terms, the issue correlations for highly educated people are just a lot higher than they are.
Your eyebrows get excited when you do math terms.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. It's, all right, but I'm glad we started talking about ideology because that dovetails to the next slide. Here we just ask for each of the candidates, do you think this candidate was more liberal than me, more conservative than me, or close to my views? So when you look at this slide, what you see is that 49% of voters said that Kamala Harris was more liberal than me, while only 39% of voters said that Donald Trump was more conservative than me. And so there was this big ideological perception gap where a lot of voters saw Donald Trump as more moderate than Kamala Harris.
What did this look like in 2016 and 2020?
So in 2016, it looked fairly similar to this. In 2020, perceptions of Donald Trump being too extreme went up relative to 2016, and perceptions of the Democratic candidate being too extreme went down from 2016 to 2020. Now, that I think wasn't a property of Joe Biden per se. Like obviously him being moderate was a big part of his brand at that time. But, in our polling, we would ask, do you think that Joe Biden is too liberal or too conservative or whatever? And we saw that over the course of 2021, as his approval ratings dipped, the perception that he was too liberal also went up.
Well, it's also true that Joe Biden became more liberal. Like in terms of how he governed and in terms of what he ran on. So you're saying that in the 2020 election, you actually did see people say that they were ideologically closer to Biden than to Trump?
Yes.
And then over time that that eroded.
The thing I want to say here before I move on is I'm really not trying to beat up on Kamala Harris here. Like, I think if you just step back, if you have a situation where the Democratic Party, where only 42% of Americans trust the Democratic Party on the economy relative to 58 for Republicans, obviously the standard bearer of the Democratic Party is going to be perceived as too left-wing unless they do a lot of stuff to try to counterbalance that.
I mean, people were living under the Biden-Harris administration. Whatever they thought of it, the line Trump would sometimes deliver on Harris, which in many ways is unfair if you're a super politically engaged voter and you have a lot of thoughts about the powers of the vice presidency. But to most people, if you have all these great ideas, why don't you do them in the last 4 years while you're vice president, was a pretty strong argument.
Yeah,
I think there's a good argument that given that, it's amazing that we did as well as we did, but it was a close election. And so I don't, who knows what the counterfactual could have been.
I want to note something as a dog that is not barking across this presentation.
Yeah.
Since the election, I think that if you look at what Donald Trump is doing, what Elon Musk is doing, and if you look at punditry about the election, that if everybody agrees on anything, it's that the election was a huge verdict on wokeness.
Do you think AOC isn't pro-capitalism to be president? I think AOC, quote me, will be president one day, okay? Maybe, assuming we still have a democracy by the end of this Trump term. Unless she wants to be like leader of the House forever or something, or like a Pelosi-esque figure, but...
Famously, one of Trump's higher testing ads was this: Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. As you're sort of running through this, I'm not saying you're saying DEI programs are popular, but I'm not seeing it emerge as a major explanation for 2024 here. I'm curious how you both think about it in the election and think about the role it's playing in the post-election narrative.
I just want to say, the they, them ad that everybody talks about, it was a good ad, but it was like a 70th percentile ad, in our testing. If you look at all of the best testing ads from Donald Trump, it was basically the economy, it was gas prices, it was immigration, it was crime. And so I think that there's definitely been an overfocus, on DEI, on wokeness, on trans issues. I think it definitely, played a role on the elite discourse and why, so many tech CEOs have become more right-wing and, all of that. But I think that the voters were really mad about inflation and crime and immigration and the budget deficit. And, I think the Republicans are making a mistake, honestly, to focus on these things so much relative to concrete issues that people actually care about. I think that there's this bigger picture point I want to make.
That's interesting that he would say that, because I feel like the strength there for Republicans focusing on that kind of stuff is that for those issues that voters do care about, I don't think Republicans are a good advocate for them. Like, if you really did care about the deficit, you're really not voting for. There's no historical evidence to vote for Republicans. The last budget surplus was a Democrat, and Republicans have historically gotten us into huge budget troubles. Trump is absolutely no exception to that. He follows the rule directly with that. So in a way, even if Americans don't care about woke issues as much, if you can keep people talking about it, at least you're not talking about an issue that you're a loser on, right? You're talking about an issue that you're winning on, with most people probably, maybe.
Where I think that a lot of people see the Trump administration as kind of a break that shows that all of the traditional rules of politics no longer apply. And I think that, I think to some extent that's wrong, that a lot of what's happening is really very easy to understand. Donald Trump, to go back to the ideological thing, he broke with his party. He might have been dishonest about it, but he disavowed Project 2025. He said that he wouldn't cut social programs. He ruled out a national abortion ban. And I think that, that kind of thing just plays a big role in his success. And I think that a lot of these newer things, that we talk about might be less important than we think. But, the flip side is it's possible that when it comes to something...
I feel like, I don't know how much I feel that is true. Who did the flip-flopper thing? Was that an attack against Kerry? Or was that against Hillary? Like, I feel like the unique thing for Trump, because he talks about, like, Trump was able to disavow these things, but nobody really cares when he does, and nobody really cares when his opinion changes. Like, Trump has a relatively unique... Well, I don't know if it's unique or if... Well, no, I think it is unique. Because Kamala Harris was able to be kind of like character assassinated based on political statements made in 2019. Now, to be fair, she didn't disavow any of like the trans stuff or whatever. But Donald Trump can just straight out not deliver ever on any of his political promises ever. And it's fine. He doesn't actually suffer any repercussions for it. Or he can just like straight out change completely from one day to the next. And his voters never really care about it. But again, I don't think it's as much of a policy thing, more as kind of like an emotive thing for why people vote for Donald Trump. But
something like, why is it that 20-year-old men are so much more conservative than they were 4 years ago? I don't know. I could believe maybe wokeness has something to do with that. But I think that the bulk of this is traditional factors.
I feel like for young people, I feel like for young people that the woke shit has to be way more explanatory. No offense, but a 20-year-old doesn't have a strong opinion on the economy. I don't think. It's just what they've heard at school or what they've seen from talk shows. You haven't even experienced the economy yet, right?
So now I just have the last slide of the retrospective. What I have here is we have the share of voters who get their news from TikTok, by year. the share of voters who get their young voters who get their news from TikTok more than quadrupled in the last 4 years.
Jesus.
This is the biggest and probably fastest change in media consumption, that has happened in my lifetime. And it was quite correlated with support change. Now, obviously, TikTok users are younger, they're less politically engaged.
I mean, they kind of do if they're broke. Yeah, I know that nobody wants to hear this in Gen Z and in Gen Alpha or whatever, but spoiler alert, all young people are broke. That's just a reality of being young. No young person was ultra wealthy ever in the history of the United States, unless you're born into it, okay? That's just always been. So if you're a young person, like, God, this sucks. I'm 23 and I can't fucking buy a house. I'm broke as fuck. I can't afford an apartment. This sucks. Yes, welcome to being young, and especially right out of school. Welcome.
It's like not surprising that we dropped among this group. You'd expect that from demographics. But if you go and you do the regressions, I think there was definitely a causal element there. And, when you zoom in particularly to people who get their news from TikTok, who don't care very much about politics, this is a group that's 8 percentage points more Republican than they were 4 years ago, and that's a lot.
So by the end of the election, Donald Trump is promising to save TikTok. One possible explanation then for TikTok users shifting towards Trump is that they like TikTok and they didn't want it to be taken away from them.
No, come on. Trump was responding. He wasn't inciting the support on TikTok. He was responding to the support from TikTok. TikTok was like, I wouldn't even say TikTok was a pro-Trump platform. I would just say TikTok was an anti-establishment Dem platform. Like, the people on TikTok on the left were just pro-pallies that fucking hated mainly the Democrats. And then people on the right were pro-Trump, but they also like hated wokeness and all the anything from the Democrats. Like, I feel like TikTok just from every political angle was just there to relentlessly shit on establishment Dems no matter what. Jesus.
Another, which people have worried about quite a bit, is that the company behind TikTok could very easily have been turning dials. Just softly, right? It's not that nothing that is liberal does well on TikTok. I've seen videos of me get posted there and do very well on TikTok. But that it would not be hard to turn up the dial a little bit on issues that are tricky for Democrats, on people complaining about the cost of living, on pro-Trump influencers, right? If, everybody who the algorithm codes as pro-Trump gets a 7% boost, that will not be obvious exactly on the app, but could be very, very meaningful in the aggregate. When you look at this data, do you think it is something about TikTok? Do you think it is something about TikTok's audience just being young people who are seeing this movement? Or does it make you suspect dial turning?
I don't know the answer to that. It's totally possible. Like, we know that they do dial turning on some topics, stuff like Ukraine or Tiananmen Square or whatever. But what I'll say is I think that TikTok represents something fairly radically different than social networks that came before it. And I'm sure, that, there could be some malfeasance on the part of people who work there. But the thing that I think about sometimes is just that I think TikTok is really the first social media platform that is really truly decentralized. Like, and what I mean by that is just, it's not based on follower graphs. Like, if you look at Reels or Twitter or whatever, how many people see a video or a piece of content is highly correlated with how many followers that person has. TikTok's a lot more random, and there's like very interesting machine learning reasons for why. But I think that it really allowed a lot of content that never would have gotten a lot of views on Twitter or on television to suddenly escape containment and get directly into the eyes of like people who don't care that much about politics. And I don't know, like, you could tell a story that maybe just anti-incumbent stuff is going to do really well on TikTok and Democrats are going to do great now. I don't really know. But I think that for whatever reason, this big change, I think, really did help Republicans. And it's just an example of how the world has really changed a lot.
So I know that you're near Democratic, both freak out and funding world. I hear a lot from Democrats about how to fix what they now call their media problem, or, sometimes you hear the TikTok problem, maybe try to seed creators and give them some support. When you look at this, do you think this is something that an established political party and a bunch of donors can do something about? Or do you think this is TikTok is a vibes machine? And basically, for reasons of inflation, for reasons of incumbency, for reasons of a censorious, Democratic Party that people gotten tired of, the vibes are bad for Democrats in 2024. And vibes machines like TikTok, like some of the other social media things, they're going to be an amplifier of bad vibes.
The vibes.
So it's not really a thing to do in the sense of strategy. What you're trying to do is be culturally, both in terms of the candidates you have,
culturally
and the actual things you
aware.
say and believe, culturally a better product. And then the things that pick up good cultural products and amplify them are going to be friendlier to you.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think that TikTok is genuinely strange relative to platforms before it, in that its audience is more politically disengaged and more working class. And I think it's just been very hard for us as a party to find, creators and content that appeals to people like that, because all of the people who work in democratic politics are not like that. And I think that in the old traditional media world, we were a lot like the media gatekeepers. And so it was kind of clear how to win that war. And I think Democrats did a good job of doing it. But now we have a totally different fight. So, to move on and talk a little bit about the present as opposed to the long time ago of, 4 or 5 months ago. So, you've talked a lot in your previous...
Look at that disgusting. Cancel this guy. Instead of hiring a camera crew to make nice live stream podcasts, he does digital panning. That's a digital pan, right? I think that's a digital pan. Unbelievable.
A totally different fight. So, to move on and talk a little bit about the present as opposed to the long time ago of, 4 or 5 months ago. So, you've talked a lot.
Wait, is it? Wait, it might not be. Because now he did the Zoom thing too. That might not be a digital pan. No, is it? Somebody email me and tell me the answer.
Previous episodes about, Trump's flood the zone strategy, where he's just constantly doing a bunch of stuff. And, what we've done here is, we've pulled all his executive orders and stuff that he's campaigned on. I think we have something like 60 dots here. Every one of these dots is a policy that we've pulled. And, what you can see is that there's a lot of variance. A lot of the things that he campaigned on, no taxes on tips, deploying, the military to the border, voter ID laws, ending remote work for federal employees. A lot of that stuff is very popular, while the flip side is a lot of stuff that he's actually doing. He talks about this stuff less, but Medicaid cuts, repealing the ACA, extending tax cuts to billionaires, a lot of that stuff is really unpopular. And just to say something a little controversial, I think a lot of the challenge of the Trump era is that they're going to try to bait us. And, we should do everything we can, to actually meaningfully resist and protect the populations that we care about and everything. But I think we need to make sure that we're preserving a considerable amount of time, to attacking Trump on the most effective things that voters are concerned about.
You've used the term bait a few times.
Instead of being
they're going to try to bait
on
us.
the defense.
Right. I think of a political party baiting you as dangling something in front of you that, they know is going to make you mad, but it isn't that big of a deal. They're doing mass firings around critical functions. They're destroying USAID. They're arrogating a huge amount of executive power. The set of things that I find Democrats are really worried about at the moment, it's, on the one hand, I suspect they're not the things that the public cares about, wants to hear that much about, making a podcaster the deputy director of the FBI. But at the same time, they're not baiting. They're real. They're important. Like, what is the point of a party? Right. They will not fight those. And this is a place where I think there is a tension between this focus on what's popular, don't focus on just the things that activate your high education, high income base. But in terms of getting people out into the streets, potentially if you need that, getting people to town halls, there's sometimes I think this thought of the party that's just going to, James Carville's been saying Democrats should basically play dead for a while and wait until the Trump administration's unpopular actions destroy the Trump administration, but don't get in the way, right? Or there's this version of a party that various things Hakeem Jeffries has said at different points have sounded like this to people. I think is a little bit more complicated than this, but we're not going to run after all these things. We're going to focus on the price of eggs, price of goods. You can really lose your own base if you're not defending democracy when they care about democracy because you're waiting for an opportunity to attack prices. When prices are kind of going to do what prices are going to do, what Democrats say about prices isn't the most salient thing. Am I getting what you're saying right? Is there a way of threading the needle? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you could imagine a theoretical world where we would have really hard and unpleasant trade-offs. But I think the world we actually live in is that a bunch of the things that we're extremely concerned about are actually really unpopular. And, just kind of going forward to the next slide, here's some randomized controlled trial data that, we did that, like I was talking about earlier with the ads, where we just kind of went through and we looked at, 58 different things that Trump's going to...
Oh, look at this. Oh, I feel good. My intuitions are generally good, I think. Fuck you guys. Like, this was the thing I was saying, like, Trump and Elon are never doing this. They're never touching Medicare, Social Security, or things like, I don't know if the VA is on here somewhere, but like, this is just never happening because even Trump knows that he would lose his base doing it. This is why I don't understand, or maybe we'll talk about this, or maybe this is the part that I don't understand. I don't understand why you have people like Schumer saying, we can't let the government shut down because if we do, they'll do truly horrible things. Good. Then I think they should do truly horrible things. Just let them do these things that are insanely unpopular so that Americans don't support them anymore. Why would we help them with that?
To do, and then we rank ordered them by how persuasive they were at actually changing people's votes and making people disapprove of Trump. And, I think that a lot of the things that we're most concerned about, Elon causing chaos in the federal government, cuts to, Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security, extending tax breaks for the rich. Obviously this list of things is not exactly the same as my top 5 things that I'm personally most concerned about with the Trump administration. But I think that the Republicans are making a lot of unforced errors that make it easier to thread the needle on these things than I think it otherwise would be true.
But these are also pretty small changes in Trump disapproval. If I'm reading what this chart is right, if Democrats attack Trump for cutting Medicare and Social Security or wanting to cut Medicare and Social Security, that increases Trump disapproval by 2.5 points. If they attack him for letting Elon slash budgets, hurting Americans and putting privacy at risk, that hurts him by 2.2 points. Going down, passing a one-party power grab to cut government services without compromise, that's 2.1 points. These kind of look the same, and none of them are very big.
Can you just think for a second? This is can you imagine 70 words? You stop a Trump voter on the street and you say the 70 words to him, and then there's a two
Yeah, it's not 2 percentage points. This is like what I said before, where it's like, bro, if a party loses 5% of its support, it's no longer politically viable. It's been destroyed in the United States. You don't need to do these huge swings in terms of voters to just completely dominate an election.
A 2.5% chance he changes his mind. I think that's incredible. I just think that these two pieces of data tell a story of how we should try to shape the campaign against Trump in the next couple months, which is that he is wreaking havoc in the federal government. I think that is consistent with our principles and also something that voters are very concerned about. That he is trying to slash support for the safety net and that he's trying to do tax cuts against the wealthy. And, I think that a lot of this critique of Trump is really very similar to the campaign that we ran against Mitt Romney. And I think that this kind of gets back to what I was saying before I feel like, we were so shocked by Trump that we kind of forgot that the old rules of politics.
I want to read 2 of these because I think something you just said is important.
Oh.
when we're talking about these old laws of politics. So here's these are all high polling, high testing messages, but this is the lowest one on the chart. So Trump is working to repeal a law that lowers the cost of healthcare and prescription drug costs and caps insulin costs at $35 a month for seniors. By repealing this law, Trump will increase the cost of life-saving medicine for millions and create more financial strain when costs are already too high. So that increases Trump disapproval by 1.9 points. I think that is as like right down the middle a Democratic message as you could possibly imagine. That does not test as well, as Trump is letting Elon Musk slash federal budgets with no oversight, checks, or balances. Musk gave $250 million to Trump's campaign, and now Trump is letting Musk reshape the government in ways that advance Musk's interests, even if they hurt working Americans by cutting the basics like Medicaid and public schools. I am actually surprised that the Elon Musk attack is outpolling the insulin attack. And it's interesting because I see this in Trump voters in my own life. Right. Some of the ones I know, they're actually not happy with what's going on in the Trump administration. There's a lot they don't like. There's a lot going on, but too much. But Musk creeps them out. Is that in your data?
I think it's really telling that Elon stuff floats to the top here because, it's really very hard for something to be competitive with Protect Social Security and Medicare. The fact that there are multiple Elon things up at the top, I think really does tell a story that there's something really unusual about what he's doing. It's very easy to tie what he's doing to harming individual people. In ads, one of the clearest patterns in ads is that getting a real person and just having them stare at a camera and talk about the ways that Republicans have personally hurt them. It's the best content. It's funny if you hire actors, it doesn't work as well. People.
It's so funny. This reminds me of that focus group. Oh God, I'm never going to forget this. Fuck! I need somebody to find me this so we can rewatch this. That focus group with the big Republican guy who does all the focus groups. Fuck, what's his name? He had the one over convincing voters to take a COVID shot. Or no, it was trying to convince. Yeah, I think it was trying to convince people that COVID was like a real danger. Oh yeah, it was a Luntz panel, and I think the most compelling argument was Chris Christie came on. And he just spoke about how I had a really healthy friend who was a huge runner, huge jogger, and then he got COVID and got sick and died. And by the end of the focus group, I think when Luntz asked everybody what was the most compelling thing, like all the data, the vaccine shit, the doctor, it was that story from Chris Christie. It was like I think almost everybody in the panel said that was the biggest thing that changed their mind. Somebody find that video for me, so I'm not just lying about that, but.
Have tried. And that's why, in some ways, I'm optimistic that Democrats will be able to thread the coalitional needle here because, we should stand, the two things that we should do is fight against social welfare cuts and also attack Elon Musk for the chaos he's creating. And I think that that's something that basically every wing of the party should be on board with.
Donald Trump is polling better than he was at this point in his first term. And, the vibes have really shifted in a pro-Trump direction. And look at how much he and Elon Musk are doing. And, I've certainly talked to Republicans who have this feeling that Trump has unlocked a sort of political juggernaut here. That he has cracked the code of American politics. But you have this slide is titled Trump is vulnerable. So why is he vulnerable?
Well, the first thing you see is that he has been
why is he vulnerable? Because he's politically retarded. He lucked into this spot. He is not an intelligent political person. He just lucked in. He was at the right place at the right time. And if Democrats could just seize the moment a little bit better, he just does so many things that are unnecessarily risky. Like he could just run his campaign in such a better way, but he doesn't because he's fucking retarded.
And getting more unpopular rapidly as time has gone on. And I just think the most predictable thing in American politics, and we get surprised every single time it happens, is president comes in, he wins a trifecta, and then he does a bunch of unpopular stuff, he overreaches, and then he becomes very unpopular and loses big in the midterms. Yeah. That doesn't mean that you can't avoid the cycle, but I think that in order to avoid it, like when you look at the people who did the best job, Clinton in 1998 or Kennedy in 1962, they did it by engaging in an enormous amount of policy restraint. And that is just not what Trump has been doing at all.
That was always the thing. I haven't studied his presidency in depth, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But that was always the thing that I heard about Clinton. When I would ever hear like economists or people who studied politics or whatever talk about Clinton, they always say that the reason why Clinton was so good at what he did was because he just shut the fuck up and got out of the way. That the economy was doing well, we were coming into the kind of like the .com era, and the world was like relatively at peace, and basically if it didn't need fixing, he just shut the fuck up and let things happen, and that was like one of Clinton's greatest strengths as a president, and it was why everything did pretty decent under him. I don't know how true that is, but
and I think that you can just see in the data. But his approval rating is dropping pretty quickly, and you can see that he's just pissing off lots of people, and that a lot of the stuff that he's doing and drawing attention toward is really quite unpopular.
There's also this reality of the coalitional realignment you were talking about at the beginning, which is Democrats now have this higher information, higher engagement coalition. Those are the people who turn out in midterms disproportionately. If I were a moderate Republican right now, or a Republican in any way vulnerable, I know they're all afraid of Elon Musk and they're afraid of primaries. I'd be pretty afraid of losing. Because it's not just that you tend to have thermostatic midterm elections, but that the coalitions have been changing such that Democrats are able to survive the 2022 midterm, which should have gone against them. And I think Dobbs saved them to some degree, but also the fact that their coalition.
I'm so curious what happens to Elon Musk after this electoral cycle, once Trump is gone, or if he gets booted from the party, which I don't think is completely impossible because, again, I mean, they've said it here, we've seen it in the past. Elon Musk is just not that popular. He's just a creepy, weird fucking loser that nobody really likes that much. And now he's torched. I hope he has with me at least. And I think a lot of other people that used to be kind of like pro Tesla, pro space. I think he's torched a lot of goodwill with those types of consumers. And I'm curious, after he leaves the Republican Party, Republicans don't give a fuck about electric vehicles. I'm sorry. Even with the whole Tesla, suck up shit, Republicans just aren't going to buy electric vehicles en masse. It's just not going to happen. What does his career look like after?
Was, as you showed earlier, right? If only 2022 voters had come out in 2024, Harris would have won.
Right.
You got to be pretty confident in Donald Trump's political skills to think that he is going to shift that dynamic. It seems that in addition to all the normal things that happens to presidents in midterms, the shape of the coalition makes midterms harder right now for Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But that said, it gets to this like tension in all of these like Democratic soul-searching conversations, which is if Democrats do nothing, really, like they'll probably be okay in 2026.
Oh, look at that! My intuitions are so good. This guy is a DGG. He just copies my takes. Didn't I say this? There's a world where like even if Democrats do fuck all and do nothing, that is possible. We just like win because of the incumbency disadvantages and the kind of tanking popularity already. And this also goes into the idea of like Schumer, I'm supposing, I don't know if he said this exactly, but this idea, because Hakeem Jeffries, I think, was basically saying this, right? They're like, listen, the Republicans are fucking up. Don't block the CR. Let them vote on it. Let them just crash the country and don't get in the way. I don't agree with that strategy, but like there's a chance that we just win the midterms anyway, right?
Because all of these voters, who get their news from TikTok, who don't care about politics, these like voters under 25, they just really are not going to vote very much in the midterms. But if we don't fix this problem, then 4 years from now, we could be in the same trust deficit on all these core issues. And these
another another charismatic candidate comes along in the Republican Party, and then we lose horribly again. It's like, oh no.
Voters that didn't turn out in 2026 will come back, and except we'll be running against a candidate who's a lot less unpopular potentially than Trump, and we could be in a real pickle.
How about the Senate?
Yeah, we are lucky in that like people talk about how much popularity and charisma that Trump has. Like I say that, but it's only with Republicans. People want to say that Trump is like another Reagan or another Obama. He's not. He's not at all. There was one analysis that Alan Lichtman made that was very true. Reagan even and Obama even had really broad approval, at least for a while, from the American public. I don't think Donald Trump has ever had an over 50% approval rating. I don't think. Like he's only mega popular with Republicans, and Democrats just don't like him. He's just never been that popular, even though it's sold to us as though he is.
Senate. So you and I did a big piece on kind of debates about populism a couple of years ago. It involved a model that you had, and that model was predicting in 2022, but specifically 2024, like Democratic Senate annihilation.
Right.
And Democrats are down a couple seats in the Senate. It's, 53-47?
Right.
It's not a good map for them in 2026.
Shut up.
And they did lose some seats that were really important to them, like Tester in Montana and Brown in Ohio. How do you see the Democratic Senate future?
If you had told me in 2019, when I started worrying about the 2024 Senate election, that we would have 47 seats, I would have jumped for joy. I think, the really big factors there is like Republicans ran a bunch of really terrible candidates in a bunch of swing races. And it turns out Democrats, those Democratic candidates did a good job of distancing themselves from the party. I don't want to spend too much time speculating about the 2026 map, but I think that even though the bias in the Electoral College has gone down quite a bit because of this swing among immigrants, that doesn't really change that the Senate. It's very hard, for Democrats to take the Senate unless they can consistently outperform how Harris did and how Biden did in most of the country. These problems won't be fixed unless we spend the next, 2 years or 4 years changing the party's brand among, working class voters who are overrepresented in the Senate. Okay, the one exception to this, I think, and this is just controversial and might get me in trouble, is I think that I'm just going to scroll up back to the Senate slide. If you look in Nebraska, the single biggest overperformance that we had was Osborne, running as an independent. He outperformed at the top of the ticket by 7.1%. Now, obviously, Nebraska is an extremely red state, and I think that we've only ever tried this strategy of running people who are literally formally not tied to the Democratic Party in extremely red states. But I think the argument for doing that kind of thing in merely red states, in places like Florida or places like Ohio or Iowa, those are hard questions, and it's not up to me, what we end up doing. But I think it's something that we have to really seriously consider. And then that also just brings up the really awkward point of like, well, what do we do with the reality that in most, by land area, in most parts of the country, it's almost impossible for a Democrat or someone with a Democrat on their ticket to win.
What do you do about the reality the Democratic brand is toxic in most of the land area in the country? Because I think you can have this conversation that you always have to be careful at which conversation you're having. Is the conversation, can Democrats win in 2026 or 2028? And the answer there is yes. Right. If the conversation is how do you get back to a place where you're putting states in play, that Democrats have just kind of given.
Yes, I like this. So, some of the DNC people I interviewed were saying this, and I think this is true. Democrats are very keen on like giving up on places. Like, oh, we can't ever win this. It's over. And then meanwhile, we, I think, kind of rightfully made fun of Donald Trump for doing. Remember, when we were close to the election, Donald Trump went and did a rally. One of his rallies was in New York City. I was like, why the fuck are you wasting your fucking time here? What a retarded thing to do so close to the election. Why? You're not winning New York, right? But I think Trump did it for fucking ego reasons because he likes New York and it's whatever, means hometown and everything. But I think there's something to be said for Democrats probably shouldn't just completely throw in the fucking towel on so much of the United States. Like, is there really so much separating Democrats that they can never win a rural area ever again? Like, is that really the case? I don't know if that is the case. But obviously, you have limited resources, limited attention and time is a resource, and money too. So maybe it's not worth thinking about it as much. But
up on Mitch McConnell's retiring in Kentucky. There's a Democratic governor in Kentucky. It's not literally true that no Democrat can ever win there. I don't think anybody seriously thinks so, that a Democrat is going to win Mitch McConnell's seat. Because the Democratic brand nationally, which is different than its kind of state party brand, is pretty bad. And people understand when they're voting for Senate, they're voting for the national brand, right? So you've been thinking about this for a long time. If you were trying to think about reversing these much deeper trends, right? These educational trends, this sort of realignment that has, if your whole point in life was to make Democrats competitive again in Florida, in Missouri, in Kansas, right? Not the reddest states, but states that they were competitive in a couple of years ago. What would you advise Democrats to do?
The reality of the situation right now, like I think there are these big theoretical discussions we could have about what positions the Democrats could take, is that Democrats are not in power right now. And so we don't have agenda control. And I think a lot of this just depends on what Trump does and and then who replaces Trump. Like something I'll say, going back to the 2016, the first time that Trump was president, is that when
Kamala went to Texas, no? Yeah, but I mean, if we were to believe what was reported by the campaign workers, the reason why she went to Texas was because she was hoping that they were going to have a conversation with Joe Rogan. But Joe Rogan was more interested in chatting with Trump. And so they basically said fuck that to that interview. So
when we were looking at polling of non-college whites, and these Obama-Trump voters, their approval rating for Trump was really very stable for most of his term. And the only time that it declined was when Trump tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And then we saw them revert kind of to their own old partisanship. But once that was out of the news, they switched back. And so, I think that does kind of, like at this moment, given that there is no party leader, I think it's mostly a question of if Trump does successfully push a bunch of welfare state cuts, then that might change the realignment. But I think realistically, at least until 2026, it's mostly a function of what Republicans do. But when we pick a new presidential candidate, that will be a reset. And I think it's, I don't think it's too early to talk about that. But I think that you could imagine us picking candidates who would do a much better job.
I think that is a good place to end. So, always our final question: what are 3 books you recommend to the audience?
I'd say the 3 books for me. I want to just call out Hollow Parties by Danny Schlossman. He's a good friend of mine, and I think it's
and Sam Rosenfeld.
And Sam Rosenfeld, of course,
colleague.
Yes, I think it's hard to talk about a lot of these questions that I was kind of dodging about why parties were doing what they did without kind of reading that. The other thing I want to call out is something that was hugely influential for how I think about politics. This is a really nerdy pick, but The Origin and Nature of Mass Opinion by Zoller. It kind of gets at this question of how much does what people say in surveys matter versus how much of it is downstream of what people are saying, what elites are saying. And I think his answer is mostly elites, but both. And then last thing I just wanted to call out was Victory Lab by Sasha Eisenberg. It kind of talks a lot about, the history of the democratic analytics industry. A lot of the stuff these numbers that I've shared here kind of come out of that machine. And so if you're just interested in kind of the history of the Democratic Party's internal analytics and research structure, it's the only book really that's ever been written about it.
David Shore, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Davey. Okay, wait, real quick. Let's just watch this.
That was probably the biggest turning point for me.
I would say I was probably 8.
Wait, at what time is the story from Chris Christie?
That was...
People aren't...
Less enough people.
Sue from Iowa.
32-17.
It was Hope Hicks, who was the youngest and most fit.
So these are a vaccine hesitant focus group hosted by Frank Luntz.
Was there in the 4 days leading up to the first presidential debate. I could then go into the West Wing. And there were 7 people in the map room at the White House for about 16 hours over 4 days together. And of those 7 people, 6 of them got COVID in the place that was the safest, most tested place in America. And the only person who was in that room who did debate prep with us, with the president, who didn't get COVID in the immediate aftermath of the first presidential debate was Jason Miller, who was one of the president's campaign aides. Why he didn't get it, I have no idea why he didn't get it. And I got it, and Hope Hicks got it, and Kellyanne Conway got it, and the president got it, Bill Stepien got it, and Stephen Miller. All of us got it. All of us got it at a bit of a different time, and all of us got it at a bit of a different severity. And by randomness, I mean I was the sickest of everybody and had the longest hospitalization. The next sickest person was the president. But the next sickest person after that was Hope Hicks, who was the youngest and most fit person in that room. someone who, ran 4 or 5 miles every day in her early 30s and was the most fit. She was out of it for a good 10 days and never had to be hospitalized, but called me during it and told me it was the sickest she'd ever been.
Oh, they didn't even die.
Two other people in my family. A 64-year-old cousin who was a smoker, and so she had some potential problem, got it, felt okay in the beginning, wound up hospitalized. Her husband, 63, no pre-existing conditions, great shape. In fact, was still working every day as an active longshoreman on the docks in New Jersey. He got sick as well, caught it presumably from his wife. They both wound up being hospitalized, and 2 weeks ago, they both passed away.
Oh.
How has your opinion changed about the vaccine, if at all? How likely were you to get it when you started this session 2 hours ago? And how likely you are now? And please, I want to know the moment if your opinion changed. I want to know the one fact, the one story, the one reason why your opinion may be different now than what it was 1 hour or 2 hours ago. So Jen from Iowa, I'm going to start with you.
So I think my opinion has changed. Before I would have said I was in the middle of the fence on whether or not I would get the vaccination. And now I'm leaning a little more towards getting the vaccination. So I probably went from a 5 out of 10 to maybe a 7 out of 10 towards leaning that way. For me, I think the most impactful part was just listening to Friedman? Sorry. Talk about some of the logistics and like when they were making the vaccine and some of the background information on it that I don't believe had been shared enough with us as Americans. And for me,
for a lot of people, when they hear things brought up by like the Joe Rogans, okay, the Himmlers and Goebbels of the world, a lot of times I say this as like an insult, but it's kind of mean to say it as an insult. But the idea that everything is a conspiracy when you don't know how anything works, I think for some of these people, just hearing an explanation on how something works was incredibly impactful, right? Like if a conservative brings up, how are they going to refrigerate the vaccines? And it's like, oh shit, that's a good point. I don't know how the fuck that seems impossible. Like just having somebody take the time to explain that can be massively beneficial. So a person just has something in their mind to go to,
that was probably the biggest turning point for me.
I would say I was probably 80% against when this started today. Now I'm probably 50-50-ish. Between the numbers that Dr. Friedman gave and honestly the story that Governor Christie gave about a healthy adult that ended up passing away from it.
Just, I know it's important, but I still internally I hate it every time I hear somebody say this. Really, that one story?
It really has made me think a little bit.
I would say I was 50-50 when we started. I'm maybe 75 in favor now of getting it. Only if it means I can get into the nursing home to see my mother. That would probably push me a lot quicker. I like the doctors. I like the medical situation when they give us the facts and talk to us without any politics involved. I think that helps me see that my bias was probably with the political side of it, getting involved and just separating the medical side of it. If I can look just at the medical and health side of it, I'm much better off than when they mix politics in with it.
What? This isn't the full panel. Wasn't there a larger one of these? I feel like almost every person spoke. There was like 3 people. Was there a live stream of this? Did I get trolled? Did I troll myself? Did my memory troll myself? These people that are persuaded by anecdotes reminds me of fuck, what's the House episode where the android guy saves them because the woman comes in at the end and she's like, you saved my husband. And House is like, you coward. Fuck, what's the name of that episode? There are House clips I haven't watched yet? What? Support mandatory voting across the U.S.? I think I probably do. Fuck it. Oh, was this? Where the woman comes in at the end.
But he is effective.
Oh. Frank Luntz should have said. Okay, all right. I love you guys. I'll be back tomorrow. We're doing anything else tomorrow. Stay safe. We're going to cappuccino, 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 my deuterinos. Do connections. Mean, king, express, shoulder, back, median, cart, spell, divider, extensions, mode, refresh, planka, lane, forward, convey. Oh, this seems like super easy. These are like parts of a road or something. What do you mean? What are you trying to convey? What are you expressing? Spell it out. Refresh, extensions. Plancha? King, back, forward, cart. Fuck, wait. Refresh. Are these things that like your browser can do? Like your back button, your forward button, refresh. You can click a button for your extensions? Is there a mode button? Web browser buttons, okay. Planka, King, mode, and cart. Oh my god. A la carte or la, is it a la carte? A la King or la King? A la mode and a la Planka? I've never heard of these two before, but okay. All right. Bourbon, cappuccino, poppuccino, hoppuccino, moppuccino, dampuccino, cappuccino, appuccino, oppuccino, my dinner is geography. I gotta go. Okay, it's late. I stream too much for you guys. You don't deserve it. Be careful. Stay safe. Bye.